Hello and happy Friday, team. I hope you guys are all having an amazing week. I wanted to get this video out before the weekend just so we can kind of clarify all the changes on these new forms, right? That we have all these new agreements. Now, I know many of you have been through training, hopefully. Many of you have been down to LVR or Realty One Group's training or our team training. The goal is that we get our arms wrapped around these new forms and know how to present them to a client with no stress, right? With ease, with understanding, to make sure that we're not losing any business, of course, and we keep our business rocking and rolling. So we're going to go over the buyer brokerage representation agreement today, the changes in the RPA and the changes in the listing agreement, and the new form they just launched yesterday, which is that amendment to existing listing agreements before July 31st, right? So if you guys had a listing or have a listing that was signed, executed before they took the co-op off of the MLS, you're going to need to take this amendment to your sellers and have them sign it. So we'll go through that as well. All right, so let's dive in to the BBRA. So this agreement is designed to allow a buyer to engage a qualified licensed professional, that would be us, for the purpose of viewing property and receiving contract negotiation and advocacy services throughout the entire real estate offer and purchase process for the types of property described below. So this is where you're going to put the property types, right? The undersigned buyer engages the undersigned brokerage firm to represent buyer concerning buyer's purchase of the below selected real property situated in the following locations. Any real property introduced to buyer by broker in the geographic area shall be referred to as the property. So this is where you're going to put the property type and location. You want to make sure that we're not too restrictive, right? We don't want to put a specific city. As we know, buyers may start in one location or one city in the Las Vegas area and buy in another, right? It's possible they end up buying in North Las Vegas, but they started off looking in Las Vegas or Henderson, right? So that's where we want to make sure that we make this as broad as possible, so we don't have a buyer come to us and say, listen, this agreement was only good if you sold me a home in Pahrump. I bought in Henderson, so I don't believe I owe you a commission. We just want to remove any of that opportunity. So put the property type. They're going to even be a condo, hotel, high rise. You might want to add those on there just to be specific as far as the property types, to include residential, investment, custom build if they're possible custom builder, right? Or somebody that wants to buy a custom home, a new home, right? Condo, hotel, high rise. You got fourplex, multi-unit, which you'll see down below in the other description, and then applicable cities. Again, you can leave that broad. Other description, again, be careful here. Don't make this too specific, like with the zip code, even though it says it in there, geographic area. You can leave that broad as well. And again, single or multi-family. All right, so make sure that you're not closing any doors to where you sell the buyer a home in a different location than what you've put on this agreement. So, or down below, check this agreement if it relates to a specific property. So this is where you would be able to go in now and put, or if there's specific addresses. Now, this might be a situation where if you've not met with this person and they've called you off of a listing, might be your listing, right? Might be a yard sign call or off of the internet, and they want to see your property. Right, you want to make sure that if you're not going to have them sign an open agreement with a home anywhere, you can make it specific to this property. May ease the tension a little bit. The buyer may say, hey, listen, I don't know you yet. I don't know if I want to work with you. You show up with this, or you go through this with them and say, guys, we're going to make this for these specific properties that I'm going to show you. Right, and we can always sit back down and adjust this, right? Revise this to include any property that I show you. So that's important to note as well. Now they are working on, and I'm hopeful that they do get us a change order or amendment to the buyer brokerage agreement, right? To be able to modify the terms of it, given that, we are going to see some modifications, whether it's the properties that we're going to show, that we start off with specific properties and we open it up to any property. Could be a change in the commissions, which we'll talk about here in a second. So with that, we want to make sure that we can change, amend this form. And so I'm hoping to see that in the coming week or two. As of right now, simply put, you can add in the additional terms, right? Or, write on the form here if there was a change to it and have everybody initial off date and initial that change and continue forward, right? So let's talk about the length of the agreement. right? This is open. You guys can put anywhere, any time frame you really want. Now, most of us have been trained and you'll have focused on 6-month agreements, really. That may change now that, again, we're presenting this to a buyer and may have not met them or may have not had the opportunity to build as much rapport that we hope to build with them. And so now it might be, hey, listen, we're going to start off with a 90-day agreement, a 30-day agreement, and we can always extend if we want to continue to work together, right? So that's important as well. Again, think about yourself presenting this to a buyer and making sure that you have every opportunity to help them purchase a home and put them at ease, right? That they are signing an agreement with you based on how much time you've spent with them, how much rapport you have with them, and knowing that you're going to earn your keep. Now we'll talk about Section 14 here in a minute, which gives it open end for that buyer to cancel the agreement at any time. And with that said in itself, is that if you put 6 months here and you said, hey, buyer, don't worry about the length of time here. My goal is to find you your dream home. In Section 14 that we'll get to in a second, if we're not working out well, right, you want to move on to a different agent, to a different brokerage, simply let me know in writing and we've canceled the contract. That's important. All right, so that's the length of the agreement. Broker fee, this is your commission section, and this is where you're going to talk about what you're charging the buyer for your fee, right? For your services. Buyer agrees to pay broker as provided below the broker fee for any properties involving the broker's efforts under Section 5. The broker fee is not set by law or by any realtor association and is fully negotiable. The broker fee is. So this says check all those that apply. Normally we're going to do 3% here or whatever percentage you want to put there. Now remember, this is another part of this conversation is that we can go down, we can't go up. In other words, we can collect, and it'll say it on here, we can collect in Section 8, we can collect less than what we put here, but we can't collect more than what we put here. That's a big conversation right now. Now, will that be able to be amended? If a builder's offering a bonus or you put 3% here and a seller's willing to pay you 4%, there's some conversation around that. My take on it is that if you put 3% here and somebody's willing to pay you more, you need to sit back down with your buyer, let them know that the seller's willing to pay more, and ask the buyer what they want to do with those funds. If they'll allow you to collect them, I think we're going to be pretty safe amending this to say, that broker's going to get paid this amount, buyer's going to sign off on that, and all's good. Right? If the buyer says, hey, I want that extra money to go to me, then so be it. It might go towards their closing costs or, their the purchase of the home. So that could be the percentage here. Some people are saying they're going to start off at 4% because we know that, again, they can go down, a little bit harder to go up though. The other fee here, now they're going to be changing this form to allow a number to be put in here. Kind of funny, I know that isn't already done, but this would be our broker additional compensation fee, the BAC fee, if you will, right? This would be the $6.95 on our team that we collect would go in this little section here. Now, I don't know if this could be modified once you're in AuthentiSign and you're going to sign this form. If we can edit that in AuthentiSign, hopefully they get us a new revised form in the coming week where we actually have room to put our fee, our BAC fee here, broker additional compensation. All right. This section here is one of the red flags I brought up when I went down to LVR. I did not like the language of it. I think it opens us up. Now, the language does benefit us, right? It says, hey, buyer, you go buy any property after our agreement expires and I'm still due a commission. The reality, though, given all the dynamics of the settlement, Section 14, where a buyer can cancel in writing, just by providing cancellation notice in writing, this leaves us open to a buyer saying, what do you mean? Our agreement's over. Now you're telling me that I went and bought a home 90 days later or whatever the days you had put in here, right? And now I still owe you a commission. Let me go speak to an attorney and see what they say. And I think that really opens us up. I think this is a losing clause for us. I do believe that if they put in here that any properties that we showed the buyer, right, that we showed the buyer. I believe that that is the correct language. They're modifying this, don't know what it's going to look like. They may remove the entire thing. They may modify some of the language. And again, I apologize that we're even having this conversation with you with a form that we're now told to use. I would recommend you put 0 days right now in this section. As of today, put 0 days, and that way we're not going to have to deal with any legal issues or a buyer freaking out because you're saying they still owe you a commission and their agreement's expired, right? It's over. All right. So buyer brokerage representation agreement, page 2. So here's your disclosures. And by the way, folks, let's go back a little bit here. So we're talking about the commission section here. Now we know the buyer's question is going to be, right? So buyer agrees to pay broker as provided below, the broker fee for any properties involving the broker's efforts under section 5. Right? The broker fee is not set by law or by any realtor associated, is fully negotiable. The broker fee is, right? The reason I'm rereading that is because all this language is the buyer agrees to pay broker. So, and you're going to put a percentage here. Now, me and my personal belief is that that is now on top of the buyer's mind, right? That is hot on the buyer's mind or heavy on the buyer's mind to say, what, oh, hold on, what do you explain that to me? That's where I believe we're going to default to section 8. Now, my other input on this was I don't know why they put the explanation of how we're collecting our commission from the seller or how we're going to attempt to collect our commission from the seller. They put it 5 numbers down. And in my opinion, the buyer doesn't care about any of this stuff until you get to number 8, because they want to know, what does that mean that I owe you 3%, 4%, whatever the number is. And so what I believe is that we're going to be immediately jumping to section 8 after we talk about the commission, right? Because we're going to want to put the buyer at ease as far as what this means for you, buyer. Well, here we go. Collecting broker's fee from the seller. Buyer may choose to negotiate that broker fee be paid in whole or in part by the seller as a credit to buyer at closing and or by the seller directly to the broker at closing. At buyer's instruction, broker will include either or both of these in buyer's offer to purchase a property, and broker will help buyer negotiate these with the seller. Broker will not retain any amount from any source that exceeds the amount agreed above, and that's what we're talking about, not exceeding this number, right? Whatever you've put in here for your fees. Now, this is important because this now is explaining to the buyer how this is all going to go down. So where you're going to ask the seller to pay their fee, and they may not have to pay any commission at all, right? And you can do it via directly getting paid by the seller, right, to the broker, or you can include some of the buyer's closing costs in that, which then, of course, the seller's only willing to pay a portion of your commission, but you're also able to get some of the buyer's closing costs, right, some concessions for the buyer. The buyer can use that credit to pay the balance or some of your commission as well, right? So that's the important part of that, is that you have to know that you can negotiate your commission directly on the purchase contract with the seller, but you can also add closing costs, which in return, your conversation with the buyer would be, hey, we're going to get you some concessions. In those concessions, you're going to use that money to pay me part or all of my commission. We're just going to get very well versed at these conversations and these different opportunities that exist now that we're negotiating our commission within the RPA. All right, so let's jump back up and get back to 4, where you're going to now go into the disclosures. Now, you don't have to jump to number 8, right? You don't have to go from 3 to 8. I just believe it's a natural progression when you tell a buyer that they owe you money, right? That they're going to owe you a commission. But 4 is disclosures. Buyer acknowledges receipt of the duties owed form explaining the duties of agents in Nevada. Buyer understands that depending on the circumstances, it may be necessary or appropriate for a broker to act as an agent of both parties for each such transaction. In such event, broker will see buyer's consent to act, right? Consent to broker's representation for additional parties as soon as practicable, and will obtain the written consent to act form signed by all parties. So that's if you're representing both parties. If you have a listing and that buyer wants to see your listing, that's where the consent to act form comes in. Right? Buyer's consent acknowledges that other potential buyers represented by a broker may consider make offers on or acquire interest in the same or similar properties as buyer. Now, what that is basically is we want to make sure that we're letting any other buyers that we're representing that have interest in the same property as the other buyers that you're representing, we need to disclose that. They have talked about using the consent to act form for that. However, the current consent to act form that we have is not made for representing multiple buyers. It's made, it's designed to have a buyer and seller sign off saying, seller, I'm representing the buyer that's purchasing your home. Buyer, I'm representing the seller of the home you're purchasing. However, you guys can use the consent to act form and modify it to where it says, hey guys, I'm representing other buyers or this other buyer in purchasing this home. I'm writing offers for them on this home. And so you disclose that conflict of interest with the buyer. So just make sure you get it in writing that you've disclosed that to all the buyers that have the same interest in the same property. Okay. Broker will exercise good faith efforts to locate and present suitable properties to buyer, tour and prepare detailed analysis of specific properties per buyer's request, right? Help buyer prepare, negotiate, and secure a contract to purchase one or more properties. Cooperate with any real estate licensee working with the seller to facilitate and complete the buyer's purchase of the property, and perform other services as needed and requested by buyer. And so those are brokers' obligations, buyer's representations and duties. So buyer agrees to work exclusively with broker and not with any other broker. Buyer agrees to furnish broker with all relevant data, records, documents, and other information, including loan pre-approval letters, proof of funds to purchase upon request of broker, and authorizes broker to furnish copies to prospective sellers, landlords, optioners, and exchangers. And a lot of language, right? Basically, buyer needs to provide you with anything you need to properly represent them in the purchase of a home. Buyer agrees to be available to examine property, responding in a timely manner to communications from broker. Buyer agrees to act in good faith to acquire the property and conduct any and all inspections of the property that buyer deems material and or important. In new home sales, right, lot sales, some sellers at FSBOs as well, right, some sellers, particularly new home subdivisions, open houses, and for sale by owner, will not compensate broker unless broker makes the first visit with the buyer. Right? If buyer makes a first visit without broker, buyer agrees to compensate broker as stated in broker's compensation. Now they have to change this as well. I've already reached out to Robert Morganti. He's the chair of the forms committee, I believe, and he's on top of this now. He's going to have that changed to above. So that was a little miss. He said, good catch, Damon. This section used to be above the compensation section. Now it's below. So now this needs to say broker's compensation above. For best experience, buyers encouraged to be accompanied by broker on buyer's first visit to the property and to conduct all negotiations for the property in good faith and exclusively through broker. All right, so exclusively. Buyer understands that signing more than one buyer brokerage representation agreement for any overlapping period of time could expose buyer to liability for paying additional fees. Buyer is not a party to any active, exclusive buyer brokerage representation agreements, right? So they're saying, right, that clause itself, they're saying that they're not part of any other exclusive buyer brokerage representation agreements. But they did add this sentence below. And this is going to be a little confusing probably for yourself and for the consumer, which is buyer is a party to whatever number, right here, insert number, active non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreements. Now, what that means is the buyer may know, I doubt they're going to, okay, I think this is going to be confusing to the public, to you as well. You'd be asking your buyer, hey, are you a party to, right, any non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreements? And buyer's going to say, well, what's the difference, right? What do you mean non-exclusive? Well, you might have signed an agreement that's open-ended where the broker says, you can go work with other buyer brokers, right? So whatever homes they show you, you don't owe me a commission if you buy a home with another buyer brokerage, with another buyer broker. We don't have a non-exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, right? So that's a challenge in itself, is that most of us don't know really what that is. Don't know if other brokers have one, right? Other brokerages may have one, and that's where this language is coming into play. I would say for the most part, just make sure the buyer is not part of any agreements. That really, for me, is the number one question. Are you a part of any other buyer broker representation agreement? No, I haven't signed anything. great, right? So this would be 0. As far as the buyer's aware, they're not familiar or they're not aware of any other agreement that they've signed. Collecting broker's fee from the seller, right? That's section 8 that we've already covered. And this is going to be a very, very important section for you to cover with this buyer. Again, preferably when you talk about the commission that they owe you, right? Buyer may choose to negotiate that broker fee be paid in whole or in part by the seller as a credit to buyer at closing and or by the seller directly to the broker at closing. At buyer's instruction, broker will include either or both of these in buyer's offer to purchase a property. And broker will help buyer negotiate these with a seller. Broker will not retain any amount from any source that exceeds the amount agreed above. All right, so second time around. Equal housing opportunity. I'm not going to read through this stuff word for word. You folks, sit down and read through this. This has same language as the original BBA or the past BBA, right? So all legal language, right? Equal housing opportunity, right? No discrimination, of course. Wire transfer warning. Right, make sure we also have the wire transfer disclosure that we give to the buyer when we first meet with them with our other disclosures. Nevada law applies to this agreement, of course, and authority capacity buyer warrants that they do have the authority, the legal capacity, authority to purchase this home. Right? And this agreement will fall on to administrators, executors, successors, and assignees. What that means is if you're working with a buyer and they pass and they have an administrator come in, they're still bound to this agreement. Now we'll get to number 14 here, which all this really becomes null and void if the buyer simply puts us on notice in writing that they no longer want to work with us. Okay. Here's your additional terms section. We're going to be sending out some idea clauses, right? That you guys may use. We want to be careful with that though, because there's a lot of talk around this cap clause, right? The buyer at a minimum will be responsible for 2.5%. And I'll be sending out language out to you. Right? I already have it. With that, we want to be careful that we're not just automatically using that. Why discount our commission if it's not needed? I think a clause like that, a cap clause like that would be if I'm meeting with the buyer and they have issues, right? They're stressed out about this commission. They're really giving you a hard time. You don't know if they're getting ready to walk out the door, or maybe you're going to lose them as a client. That's when you might start looking towards clauses that would keep them in the game, right? We're a cap clause. Hey guys, don't worry about I put 4% up top here for the commission. However, should I not be able to negotiate all of that commission from the seller, right? I'm willing to accept a minimum of 2.5%. Right now, when you do that, right, we don't know what the seller is willing to pay yet. So you automatically, are going to be sending over your RPA, hopefully with the 3% or 4% that you're asking for. And if the seller counters back and says they're willing to pay you 2%, your buyer would be responsible for 0.5% if you put that cap in here. Again, we'll share the language here, but we want to make sure that more important than anything is that you're only using it when needed, because you don't want to discount your commissions right out of the gates. We want to make sure that if the buyer is willing to pay your commission, if the seller comes back at 2%, they're going to pay you 2%, and the buyer is willing to cover 1%, you get your 3%, right? You put this cap in here, and now you've limited it to 2.5%. All right, so that's important to note as well. All right, we'll share some other language with you as well. I don't want to get too far down the road here without seeing what modifications they may make to this buyer brokerage representation agreement to where we add additional language. And we also want to make sure we vet it out through Realty One Group, their attorney. So we're keeping you guys safe, of course. Right? Cancellation, of course, and then the buyer's going to sign off on it. We sign off on it. And I do see that I believe they removed the language that it's not valid unless the broker signs it. Right? So I like that they removed that, because that was always but we do want of course, the broker sign it. But as soon as you sign it, it's valid. You can go show them homes. You don't need the broker to sign this to be able to go show the buyer homes. All right. So that's the buyer brokerage representation agreement. Still a couple of questions will hopefully get answered in the week ahead, and to create clarity for everybody. Okay, let's go to this Next form, which is the RPA. Let's just jump right to the RPA. And I'm only going to go over the change on the RPA. So this part will be much shorter than the entire buyer brokerage representation agreement that we just covered. And we'll be redoing these videos. So just use these as a reference for right now. And then when we get a little bit more clarity, I think we can clean these videos up to where you guys are really clear on all the changes and what you need to do with these agreements. So page 2 of the RPA is where the change was made, the most significant change, which is buyer representative buyer broker compensation. At the close of escrow or the exchange of the subject property, seller shall pay the buyer's representative, buyer's broker, right, a certain percentage. Now, this is where you're going to put your commission. Again, let's say that we're putting 4%, right, whatever that number is for you. This would be if there's a flat fee. If this was 0 or NA, right, and you put over here that you're going to get $10,000. That's the only difference here is you're either going to do a flat fee. Now, most of the time we're doing a percentage. Right? Most of the time we're putting a percentage in to ask for that seller to pay for our commission. Right? So here's the 3% of the gross sales price of the property. Right? Upon execution, this would be NA. Oh, you can't put NA, so you have to put 0. Upon execution of this residential purchase agreement or subsequent counteroffer, this clause is no longer negotiable exclusively between buyer and seller, and any modification thereafter must be ratified in writing by the buyer's representative, buyer's broker. Now, what this means is once this is executed by the buyer and seller, we're due our commission that's been agreed upon. That does not mean that it can't be negotiated through the contract, right? I've had that question come up. That means that it can be negotiated, but we have to agree. The buyer broker has to agree to any change. But think of this, folks. We have negotiations all through an escrow, right? We have the request for repairs that buyer seller negotiate. We have, if there's a appraisal deficit, right? The appraisal comes in low. We normally are negotiating, right? Buyer and seller are negotiating. Sometimes our commission is part of that conversation. Now, more than ever, it will be part of that conversation, or could be part of that conversation, because seller now has an open door to say, hey, listen, we're paying you 3%. Appraisal came in low. We want the buyer broker to reduce their compensation to 2%. Now, that's going to go to the buyer. You're going to sit with your buyer, of course, and say, buyer, right, I don't negotiate my commission. So what do you want to do? Do you want to pay above appraised value, right? Do you want to go back at the seller and have them reduce the price, right? Do you want to, with request for repairs, do you want to accept the property as is? Do you want to counter back and ask the seller to make sure that they do the repairs? So now our commission could be part of that conversation now. Never was before. Once the co-op was offered on the MLS, we that's what we were getting. I mean, it could be a part of the conversation, but it wasn't a shoe-in to be negotiated. Now our commission can be negotiated, which means they can ask that wherever the money's coming from the seller, right? That money can change. Right? I'm paying 3% to the buyer broker. I don't want to do the request for repairs. Buyer, you either accept it as is, or you take it or leave it, or you talk to your buyer broker about reducing their compensation to make up for that gap. All right. Same thing with appraisal. So that's what you guys might see. And I'm going over that. Just be prepared, right? That when you read this language, it says, oh yeah, you guys can't negotiate my commission. No, it says they can't negotiate it without our approval, without the buyer broker approval. Doesn't mean that it can't come up throughout the escrow as a negotiable item, right? And then we would make a decision at that point in time. All right. So that's the major change on the purchase contract. I don't need to go over anything else. We are now negotiating our commission within the offer to purchase. And this is also going to be important for you with your sellers. I would take a copy of your purchase contract and go over it with them and let them know what now it's going to look like when an offer comes over. Now, you are still having sellers out there. This is another hot topic right now where everybody's talking about, do we offer compensation? Do we not offer compensation? So let's talk about that as we jump over to the listing agreement and then we'll go over that new amendment and get you folks on to your weekend or whenever you watch this video. All right, so here's your exclusive authorization right to sell, exchange, or lease brokerage listing agreement, the new one. And the main change in here, let's just dive right down to the main change, which is the compensation shall be due section, right? Compensation to broker. So here we're going to talk about, compensation commissions are not set by law or by any realtor association. They are fully negotiable. If during the listing term seller sells the property and the sale closes, or the sale fails to close due to seller's breach of the terms of the residential purchase agreement, right, seller shall pay the following. This is where the seller agrees to pay a commission of. Now, this is only for the listing side, the listing broker. And we have to really get clear on this, that we cannot include any longer, even if you're willing to offer some of your commission, agent, it cannot go here. This is only for the seller side commission, for the listing broker commission, period. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? And you can also do the $6.95 transaction fee here, right? For our fee, the brokerage fee. So 3%, $6.95 of the final sales price or lease amount to the listing broker upon the successful closing of the subject property. This commission is exclusively for the listing broker services and is not subject to sharing, splitting, or otherwise distributing to any buyer's broker or agent. That's the language, right? Can't share it. The seller acknowledged that any commission arrangement with the buyer's broker, if applicable, must be covered by a separate agreement. Residential purchase agreement is not covered under this listing agreement. That is very important. Now, so let's talk a little bit about co-op. Now, you're going to meet with your seller, and everybody's saying, well, can the seller still offer a co-op? Yes. Legally, the seller can't be forced not to offer a co-op if they want to. The challenges that you're going to find is this. You meet with your seller and you go over the process with them. Guys, I've been selling homes for 23 years and there's been a recent change. We no longer put in the listing agreement that you're going to be offering a buyer broker co-op. Doesn't mean that you can't offer a buyer broker co-op, right, to induce a ready, willing, and able buyer. Just know that it's going to be negotiated in the residential purchase agreement. Here's a copy of the residential purchase agreement, page 2, top of the line. This is where the buyer broker now is going to put in, right, the commission that you're going to pay them, right? So it's going to be negotiable. Now, you can still offer a co-op, right, to say, hey, I'm motivated, or I really want you to bring a buyer to the table. And with that, we just can't add it into the listing agreement. It will definitely not be on the MLS either. And what I would even recommend is, because having a seller offer a co-op, when it's now going to be negotiated, you possibly could be misrepresenting your seller, because you're now saying they're going to offer 3%. Well, what if they get an offer in that's $20,000 below list price? Do they still want to offer that same co-op? And letting them know that it's negotiable, that it's not in stone, is going to be very important, because if you don't, and they told you, well, I'll offer 3%, they get a lowball offer or whatever, and they end up accepting that offer, right? And they don't think about negotiating that commission, that buyer broker commission, and they come back to you after the fact and say, you know what, listen, I feel like now I know why this lawsuit began. I paid a commission that I feel I should have been able to negotiate, given I had multiple offers, given it was a lowball offer. And I remember when we first met, you just told me to tell you a number to offer, and it was 3%. And I thought that was in stone. That's the challenge, right? That for on the list representing a seller right now, is that we have to be so careful that we don't find ourselves back in the same boat where a seller says, I didn't know I had the ability to negotiate that, right? They told me I should offer a co-op. I said 3%. So just make sure you read that word, that word negotiable, huge right now, right? Negotiable. And it's not going to be in writing either to the other side, which means unless you've created a form, which we don't create forms, unless LVR creates a form where there's a broker to broker co-op agreement, right? Where the seller says, I'm willing to pay this, and the seller signs off on it, or seller, signs off on it, right? Seller signs off on it and the buyer broker signs off on it. And now you have an agreement in place. We don't have that vehicle right now. And I don't know that they're going to create that vehicle because it's negotiable, right? It's negotiated in the RPA right now. If you want to put in your notes, right, in your communication log with the sellers advised you, instructed you because they're motivated, because they want to let the world know that they're willing to pay a co-op, make sure you write it down, have the seller sign off on it that, hey, seller, you told me to offer this co-op, to put this in my marketing, on my flyers, on my website and all that good stuff. The other thing that you may want to consider is terms. Seller, under what terms do you want to offer this co-op, right? So we're clear, right? And also we'll let the other side know, right, buyer brokers, that that it's negotiable, right? That it's going to be negotiated, but buyer broker seller will offer 3% full list price offer, no closing costs, no concessions. Bring your offer, and we'll review it. And if it meets the guidelines of this co-op, then seller's good to pay the co-op. So again, be careful that you don't get too far in the weeds with this, with offering a co-op. You might want to be a little bit more specific on what that co-op is going to, what that offer needs to look like in order for that co-op to be paid, and or leave it open. I think what you're going to see mostly right now is you're going to say, yes, the seller, if you reach out to a listing agent, yes, the seller is willing to pay a co-op, right? Submit your offer, and we'll negotiate the co-op within that purchase contract. I believe that's where you're going to see a lot of agents go. However, we are starting to see agents already, e-flyers and websites and everything else where they're now offering a co-op. They're just going to need to make sure the conversation with their seller, that they're very clear that the seller still knows that that still is a negotiable item based on the terms of that offer. Okay, so that's the big change here. Compensation shall be due is all pretty much relatively the same as the original one, which just goes over what happens for us to ultimately get paid a commission if we sell the property. Of course, if the seller transfers the property, conveys it, or makes it unmarketable, we'll do a commission. We'd have to, of course, pursue the seller for that, which we rarely would, right? If number C is if within a certain amount of calendar days, we can put 90 days. If the buyer that's seen the home while we had this contract signed with our seller, this listing agreement, comes back within 90 days and buys the home, and the seller has not signed a new listing agreement, right? Our agreement's over. Seller says, I'm not signing another listing agreement. And a buyer that we showed the home to, or that showed the home when we had the listing, comes back and buys that home, we're due a commission. The whole purpose of this section really is to avoid a seller going around your back, right? Buyer comes to the house, seller meets them, right? Seller's home for the showing or whatever, and says, hey, my listing agreement's over in a week or two. And if you come back in a month, right, let's just, let some time go by. I won't sign a new agreement. My agreement's over in a week, and come back and we won't have to pay any brokers. And I'll even share some of the savings with you, buyer, and we'll just do the deal together without any real estate brokers. That's what that is meant to prevent. Okay. All right. So that's the change, the big change in the listing agreement. Right. And now let's go to the status change, where now if you guys have a current listing agreement, this is the form that they just launched. Now, right out of the gate, I've already reached out to all of our managers. I know it's a long video, folks, bear with me, but I've already reached out to the managers, and they really couldn't answer what goes in this top line, right? Because it's not real clear. And so I've shared with them that my opinion of it is that you guys just simply put the exact agreement that you guys have with your sellers in here, which is the exclusive authorization and right to sell. So you're going to take this language right here, right? Exclusive authorization, right to sell, exchange, release, listing agreement, and you're going to put that here, right? This form constitutes an amendment to the following listing agreement: the exclusive authorization, right to sell, listing agreement, hereinafter listing agreement. That would be best practice. The MLS number, property address, agent name, brokerage name is all right below. All right. Now let's read through this form. Right. The status change amendment makes changes to the terms of the listing agreement for your above listed property. Read this form in its entirety. You should discuss your options with your agent and or broker before you complete and sign this form. Fill out the related form fields as appropriate. Sign and date this form and return to your agent or broker before August 15th, 2024. Right, the National Association of Realtors Settlement Agreement. So it explains the settlement agreement. Multiple listing service, MLS, are local marketplaces used by both listing brokers and buyer brokers to share information about properties for sale for the benefit of their buyer and seller clients. The Las Vegas Realtor MLS, LVR MLS, serves agents and brokers licensed in Nevada. The Las Vegas Realtors LVR joined the National Association of Realtors settlement agreement, right? The settlement requires realtors and MLSs to make practice changes, including the removal of unilateral offers of compensation, otherwise referred to as a co-op, to buyer brokers from the MLS, and the implementation of new and updated policies. As of 7/31/2024, all offers of compensation to buyer brokers and concession to prospective buyers were removed from the MLS and will now be negotiated on the residential purchase agreement. Through the buyer broker, commissions are no longer allowed on the MLS. The settlement preserves your choice as the seller as to whether to offer compensation to buyer brokers. So can't keep the seller from offering compensation, just not going to be done on our listing agreement and or through the MLS, right? Your broker agent can discuss options with you. We just covered that in going over the listing agreement. Broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable, right? Compensation commissions are not set by law or by any realtor association. They are fully negotiable. Compensation to broker. Compensation commissions, you can see this is repetitive, right? Are not set by law or by any realtor association. They are fully negotiable. If during the listing term, seller sells a property and the sale closes or the sale fails to close due to seller's breach of the terms of the residential purchase and sell agreement, seller shall pay the following. The seller agrees to pay a commission of. Now, if you guys have a listing agreement in place, you're going to put only, just like we went through on the new listing agreement, you're only going to put the listing broker commission in this section. Now, this is going to change. This is going to amend your current listing agreement. That's the importance of this, right? And you can do the and your $695 transaction fee here. Okay, that's what goes here, of the final sales price to the listing broker upon the successful closing of the subject property. Again, same language as in the new listing agreement. This commission is exclusively for the listing broker services and is not subject to sharing, splitting, or otherwise distributing to any buyer's broker or agent. The seller acknowledges that any commission arrangement with a buyer's broker, if applicable, must be covered by a separate agreement, residential purchase agreement, and is not covered under this listing agreement. Same language as the new listing agreement. Any agreement made on this amendment will supersede any previous agreements and is not in addition to. It's basically saying this is going to override whatever you have written in your current listing agreement. All right, all offers of compensation to buyer brokers were removed from LVR MLS. A listing broker is required to obtain a residential listing agreement signed by the seller in order for a property to be input into the LVR MLS. The LVR MLS residential listing agreement that this form amends may have directed your listing broker to publish an offer of compensation to buyer brokers in the LVR MLS prior to 7/31/2024. This offer to compensate buyer brokers, which was expressed as either a specified dollar amount or as a percentage of sold price in the co-op fields, was removed from the MLS on 7/31/2024. Now, this is where you're going to have the conversation with your seller that it's removed from the MLS. This amends my commission. This is going to only apply to my commission as a listing broker. Seller, do you still want to continue to offer a co-op to the buyer broker, given it's going to be negotiated in the offer, which means when we receive an offer, here's again the copy of it. The buyer broker is going to put in here the commission that they were asking you to pay, either through concessions to the buyer or directly to the buyer broker. Right? Do you want to offer any compensation? Do you want me to market any compensation co-op to buyer brokers? Let them answer that question. If they do, the next question for me would be, are there any specific terms in which you want to offer this co-op, right? Well, yeah, if it's a full list price offer, if we get this, if we do that, if we don't have to do that, again, that's going to be an important part of the conversation as well. And if they say, listen, let's just offer 3%, And when we get an offer over, right, based on that offer, we're going to negotiate it. So just know that just because there's a marketing flyer out there and or website, and I think this is a little bit of a challenge, but it is what it is. A website, flyer, whatever that says there's a co-op offered, it's not an agreement yet. Okay, you're not going to be able to take that marketing flyer as a buyer broker, right, and go and force the seller to pay that because it's negotiable. Right, it's going to be in the RPA, and if the RPA gets signed off and it's different than the flyer you have or what's on their website, that's the agreement. What gets signed off on, and we know that, right? Best practice. So I would just be careful and educate your buyers and your sellers, right? Of this new change, of course, and if there's a co-op being offered, let your buyers as well know that this can be negotiated, right? Until we get it signed on that agreement, things can change. It's going to be an important part of that conversation because it may affect your buyer, right? If it changes, if it drops lower, your buyer still may be responsible to cover some of that commission. Okay. Now, or negotiate. All right. So that's another part of this is that, you guys, there's different options. You want to be careful with, how you present this to your buyers, this buyer brokerage representation agreement. Right. When you go through the commission section and you say, hey, you're responsible to pay this certain commission, right? And then you go through number 8 with them and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to collect it from the seller. We're going to do everything we can. And the buyer says, well, what if you can't collect it all? Right? That's the question. Well, if we can't collect it all, we're going to sit back down and go over your options. I truly believe that is the next best thing to say. Now, that might not have all the answers. Buyer might say, well, what's our options? Or what are the options? Well, we can continue to negotiate, buyer. Right? We can counter back. We can counter back and keep my commission up. We can counter back and leave my commission. Let's say the seller countered 2%, I'm getting 3%. We can counter back and see if they'll pay some of your closing costs to absorb some of that commission as well. Maybe the seller that is okay paying some of your closing costs. They just don't want to pay more than 2% of the commission. Now, seller's probably going to know through their listing broker that buyer signed a BBRA and that those concessions are going to get paid through to you as commission, but broker could be just principal. Hey, listen, I get it. Buyer's paying. I'll pay some of their closing costs. Let them pay some of the commissions. I'll pay some of the commissions. I'm good with that. Or whatever. Next one would be to move on from that property, right? They don't have to purchase that home if the gap is too wide for them commission wise. And of course, you can negotiate with the buyer on your commission if it makes sense. So there are options. And so let's be careful that we're not just talking with the buyer saying, hey, if the seller doesn't cover it right out of the gate, right? A buyer says, well, what happens if the seller doesn't pay your commissions? Well, you're going to be responsible to cover the rest. Now, you can say that if you're confident and the person you're sitting across from, you're confident saying that and you believe they're going to do it, or whether they do or not, that's your business model. Well, you'll have to take care of the rest. I truly believe though that the better way is to say there's options, right? Because there are options. It's not just so cut and dry that you're going to have to cover the difference, buyer. We have options. Negotiate, move to a different property, right? Discuss the commission, see what's best for you, see what options you do have, buyer, to move forward with this property. So remember that. With that, folks, the last thing I do want to cover with you that I didn't cover earlier, and I know we're a long video here. You guys can bite-sized piece this or whatever, but there were some other changes to the RPA that I did mean to cover. And again, I'm going to do a video on the entire RPA here in the coming week. I just want to get this out to help, and probably not even, there's still some unclarity with the buyer brokerage representation agreement. So, but in here as well, they did change the language in the contingency sections. They added really what I feel is really great information in here, which is they removed that the seller doesn't have to sign off on to release the earnest money, which we know title and escrow, they do make the seller sign off on, right? And so there's a law for that. It's NRS 645A.175. If you guys have the opportunity to jump in real quick, Google that and look it up. It basically is escrow, how to handle escrow monies. And what we'll say in there is that escrow does need both parties to sign off on, but if one party is holding up monies in bad faith, it's possible that they could be penalized no less than $100 up to 1% of the purchase price for holding on, for keeping that money hostage in bad faith. Now, if it's in good faith, they can go mediate and all that good stuff. But I do like that they added this language. We're going to want to make sure we get familiar with this so we can explain to our buyers and our sellers, right, when they sign off on this agreement, that, hey, if something goes south here, we need to be very clear that, we're following the terms of the contract, which means if the buyer cancels within their due diligence properly, seller, I'd advise you, per the contract, to release, sign off on release the earnest money. If not, here's NRS 645A.175 and what it says for you to review, because you want to know what liabilities you might have by holding on, by keeping that money hostage, right? You guys have a great weekend. I'm going to do more videos, more detailed, with more clarity, of course, once we get some answers back on the BBRA, hopefully in this coming week. And I'll do an entire video for the purchase agreement, listing agreement, just for those that want to go over from page 1 to page 11 and the listing agreement as well. But anyways, have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week.